Today we are looking at how to unclutter or declutter or get rid of the clutter that you see in your photograph. Now all that assumes at first you found a good composition or something that you can change things around a little bit to create a good composition. Because no matter how much we get rid of clutter or stuff that's not necessary, if the composition's not good, it's not going to get off the ground at all. So that being said, most of my photographs that I take are early morning or late afternoon where the shadows are longer. Doesn't mean you can't paint midday. Not that there aren't good compositions during midday, but it is harder to compose. It's harder to paint during the midday. So majority of my photographs are early morning, late afternoon, and I would recommend that. And it doesn't have to be far off places with real dramatic scenery, just neighborhood, backyard, where there's a lot of dark and light contrast, long shadows, interest, some contrast in there to create some interest and a sense of light. So we'll start with this one, and there's several things to think about when we're decluttering. Of course, the first thing is just to get rid of what's not necessary. We can do that by cropping, zooming in, deciding what's focal point and how much we can eliminate. And here, this is a cabin in Wyoming. And I like the door and the play of light on the door and on the shrubbery here in front of the door, and the light and dark on the cabin itself. What I don't care for, or has nothing to do with the painting, is the big trees back over here. Even either side of the cabin really doesn't interest me at all. So I can crop this several different ways, but I want to get rid of things that aren't necessary. And that gives me a good composition. Now I can decide to make it a little longer, a little more horizontal instead of vertical. It's a bit more square, or probably more vertical. And even here, there's things I don't need. I don't need the satellite dish. It doesn't add anything to it. I'd probably simplify trees instead of having 3 or 4 definite trees back in there. Just have a shape of trees that allow the cabin to pop out. Too many sky holes, little darks and lights in the background. So that's one way, just really zooming in on the focal point and then getting rid of everything else. And of course, this is a very close-in subject matter. It's not a lot of depth or things around it, so there's not a lot of, once I zoom in, I've gotten rid of most of the clutter. Now here, this is a photograph, southern Arizona. And what I like, again, is that low light, putting everything in shadow here. Everything in the foreground is in shadow. And of course the background is mostly light with some dark in there. But there's a lot of clutter here. And don't want to do that yet. I want to get rid of, first of all, the fence, railings. It's just way too much stuff going on there. I might decide to put some of the fence in, but I'm not going to start with the fence, and I'm not going to add it all. It's just too much clutter. Same thing with the trees. I want to sort through the trees, decide what's important and what's not. But first of all, go ahead and crop and get rid of things that just aren't necessary. So getting rid of a lot of stuff. Zoom into what draws you to the painting. And here I have the house too centered. I should have moved it over one way or the other. Probably a bit more over to the right. But if I could change it now, but would. But the thing I want to do here now is create more definite layering where there's going to be a definite value change. And that's going to simplify. And by that I mean, of course, I have the foreground here as one layer. Then I have these trees that are in the sunlight, but they're kind of somewhat on the same line, same kind of layer. That's the foreground. And then behind that, I might have another group of trees that are going to be one value in color. And then behind that, maybe distant mountains or another group of trees. So that I went about 3 layers here. And you don't see the layers necessarily in the photograph. Everything's cluttered. But by pushing some of the objects up front a little bit, some in the middle ground and some in the background, and I have to give contrasting values. So if these foreground trees are in sunlight, then the ones in the middle ground are going to be simplified, one value, and darker. And then maybe the group behind that is just more blue, more distant, but still a different value. So I'm taking 3 layers, creating just 3 simple values and separating them. And that looks something like this. You can see my background layers here. Back in here, I might have just 1 background layer instead of 2. But it's this gray or violet. And in the photograph, I do see a lot of grayed violet, but I see a lot of that yellow hill way in the distance. And to paint it like I see it, just pulls it forward. Doesn't give me any depth back in there. So I'm putting everything behind these trees. I'm putting it all kind of that muted violet. A couple of values of it. In the foreground trees, these are cottonwoods, so they're real light branches, and I don't have them as light as they are in the photograph. They're a little bit lighter. Some of them, I guess overall they're darker. So I got them somewhat darker sunlit gray, in orange and blue or yellow and violet, but a different value from the background and a lot warmer than the background. And then some of the yellow leaves. This was just after autumn. All the leaves were about gone. Same thing over here, a bit more red-orange. They probably weren't that red. Well, they were too. Pretty red in there. Now, my red doesn't match, but it doesn't matter. It's a stronger color against this gray cottonwood little branches that give me that warm kind of gray, and that stands out against the cooler, grayer background. It's really not grayer, but it is a lot cooler. So it's those two, simplifying the background and the middle ground trees so that they stand out. Because in the photograph, they don't. I want more separation between that background and foreground. So getting rid of the clutter of little branches that don't matter and just seeing mass and shape. And then the foreground, shrubbery and trees. I don't care for this color I came up with here. It's too brownish looking, but probably add a bit more blue to that. Not a very nondescript color. Maybe ultramarine blue, cad red deep with a little bit of orange. Not quite as red-orange as I have here, a bit more of a blue-violet. And it's in shadow. And then the shadow here, very blue here, and probably a blue with some red-orange in here. But these are lighter than the shrubbery here. So I get a good value change. Even though they're both in shadow, there's a value change there. And then by hitting the buildings the lightest, making sure nothing's that light as the building. That's my kind of focal point. Then maybe I'd come back and hit in here, fence posts or 2. Too much, though, is going to create a distraction from the light effect on the trees. Then this one, very cluttered. It's hard to see, see the forest from the trees. So again, what I have here is a lot of strong contrast of dark and light. So I have this shadow, and this tree is in shadow, or these trees, a bunch of little trees. And then this big tree is in shadow, and that tree is in shadow. So these are shadow and shadow on the ground. And that's going to separate from the sunlit trees back in here, the next layer. And then also the sunlit trees in here. And in there as well. But then I have shadowed trees here. Again, I can simplify this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of 6 trees all lined up in a row. They're evenly spaced. So I'm going to lose that. But that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of trees in there. And that's what I want to separate. That's what I want to simplify. And of course, I need to crop it also. So there's my layering. Here's the foreground dark trees. They're in shadow, so they're going to be dark. And it's sandwiched by this simple light in the background. And I want to make that lighter than what I see here. So it lays down more. Now the grass in front is going to be a little darker because it's closer. And by keeping it lighter back in here, that creates more depth because things get lighter as they recede. Then my light trees, kind of aspens in the summer here. And then behind that, a little darker. These are aspens and pine trees that are kind of in shadow, so they're darker. They're not much darker. a cast shadow over them, and then just the background muted blue, blue-violet to show that depth back in there. And I don't think there is any. No, there's no mountains back in there that you can see anyway. So just adding some separates things a bit more. And I could change the colors if I want to more autumn colors, but it's the value simplification there and pulling things together, forcing everything into one color, one value, so that it reads on that same level. And I can have some dark accents in there, like in these trees here, but they're still one light value, one dark value, and they kind of stay in the middle. And then these are the more background trees. So the more I can simplify that, the better. Too cluttered and a lot more simplified. Also, the foreground here, this tree trunk with all the dirt and everything, very distracting, all the clutter around it. 2 logs here and a log back in here as kind of lead-ins really help. So first of all, it's just simply cropping. Would get rid of a lot of clutter that we don't need. Second is to create layers, the kind of foreground, middle ground, background, and pull it in together into simple shapes or values and color and shapes. And then third, using that strong contrast, like the cast shadow here, sunlit here, sunlit here. It just gives me simple shapes to push everything into. Make a decision. It has to fit in one of those shapes and get rid of the detail. It forces you to see past all the clutter if you can simplify like that. And I like this photograph, but I have to find a way to get things separated more into more simple shapes and values.